Kav, Eskimo Joe, welcome back to noise11.com and happy being a classic rock band finally.
Yeah, I think we've finally embraced who we always truly were, which is just a good old rock and roll band from Frio.
Well, I think once you get the best of or the greatest hits out, that does qualify you with the term classic rock.
Yeah, well, I thought maybe once when I was younger, I thought it was a dirty word. Now it feels like a lovely, well-worn cardigan that I like to wear on the weekends.
Yep, as long as Triple M can say Eskimo Joe from their greatest hits album, that's it. That's it.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, the world repeats itself somehow is a very interesting title. I guess it's a clever way of telling the audience what this album is all about. It's sort of from the beginning to now, with one exception, Wastelands. Wastelands seems to be sort of not recognised in this list of songs.
Yes, there is a reason behind that. At the end of Ghost of the Past, we decided to kind of go do some, go off and be independent for a while. And as you can see, this is a Warner's release. So this is really, with the exception of like Sweater that made it on there, I think Ruby Wednesday's on there as well. This is basically it's a Warner's release. So it's a kind of best of our Warner's years, really.
And Ruby Wednesday, I should congratulate you just on the title.
Well, yeah,
it's the day after Ruby Tuesday, obviously.
That's correct. You got it. We thought we were very clever at 19 years old. We're like, Ruby Wednesday, yeah.
Well, I liked it. Going back to Sweater, that was 1998. I mean, it's like bizarre to imagine Eskimo Joe as being a 90s band. That's a whole other millennium.
Yeah, we just kind of scraped in there, and I think by the time we were very lucky with Sweater because that came out, and we expected we'd sell what we called Perth Gold, which was 500 CDs in a place called the Grosvenor Back Room in Perth, which is where all the bands played back in the day. So we thought that would happen, and then lo and behold, they started playing it on Triple J, and we started touring, and then 22 years later, here we are. So yeah, that's kind of where it all started. And then when we went on to, Ruby Wednesday, that was I think we kind of felt the weight of, having to follow up a behemoth, which was Sweater it did really well, much better than, anything else was doing in Perth at the time. So, we're excited, but kind of daunted to kind of move from there to the next songs. But we made it there eventually.
1998, how long were you out of school at that point?
Like 2 years out of school. I think I was about 19, 20 years old. So 2 or 3 years out of school. Myself and Stu had been very good friends since we were about 5 years old, and myself and Joel had started a band at the end of high school when we were about 17. So we're all kind of into it, but everyone was at university and stuff at the time. So thinking that they might have real jobs. And then the next thing we were kind of doing this music thing, and I felt like, the fate just kept intervening, going, no, this is what you need to do. Because each time any of us were like, oh, maybe I'll get a degree and do something, like another kind of chapter would unfold in the Eskimo Joe story. And we'd be like, oh, okay, I guess we're doing this now. So, yeah.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because Sweater, 1998, and Ruby Wednesday on the other side of the millennium, but it actually took quite a few years to get to the Girl album. That considering that Sweater came along and Triple J were all over it at the time, it took a long time to get to that first album.
Yeah, look, I think what happened is, it was, I don't think we were thinking about it too seriously. I think we wrote the song Sweater, and we were entering this thing called the campus band competition, and we thought at the time, we were like, look, if we can write 3 more of these, like, we'll win the campus band competition. And lo and behold, we did. We won it, and part of the prize was to record an EP, which was the Sweater EP. And so then by the next EP, we were still kind of mucking about and really just writing songs in the jam room, and just like with this kind of tongue-in-cheek attitude. But that wasn't and it was very punky, and that was the kind of style of the times, but it wasn't really the music we listened to. We grew up listening to the Beatles and Bowie and Neil Young and and Crowded House, and to name a few. So by the time we got to Girl, we really had to kind of say, all right, well, what kind of band do we want to be? And I guess at that point in time, we could have literally changed our name and been like, okay, now we're going to be this band and we're going to write, real songs or whatever. And so the reason why Girl kind of took a while to get there is we sat down and we really were like, okay, we're making a record now. Let's make something that we'd want to listen to at home. Like, let's put something on that is like sounds as good as our favorite albums. And so, we've been driving around in a tour van a lot by that point in time, and our musical tastes had converged a bit. And we've been listening to a lot of Supergrass at the time. I think we've been listening to let me think, The Police was a big one, and a bunch of other bands. So Girl was really us kind of making a statement of like, we want to be considered as serious musicians, not a novelty band.
Well, when Girl came along, it's interesting that you're name-checking all of those artists there, but working with Ed Buller, who had already had a history with Suede and Pulp, he must have brought an incredible amount of experience into the studio for that first record.
Ed really taught us the art of how to write a song for a record, like really pop music 101. The classic thing is we started off this week of pre-production with Ed, and we went to the Bakehouse Studios, which is like these rehearsal rooms in Melbourne, and we sat down with him, and we'd be playing through these songs, just thinking they were the best songs in the world, and he'd be like, bored, you're boring me, and we're like, what, sorry? And he kind of really got us into this idea of like, the chorus has got to happen on the minute mark, you got to edit. Like, he really got us into like, the most of his work he did was in that first 2 weeks, where he showed us how to edit down our songs. And we also had this moment where he came back from a lunch, with the record label, as we're recording the record at Sing Sing Studios, and he kind of looked a little bit ashen faced, and we were like, what's going on? And he said, well, you've got to write 2 more singles, otherwise they're not going to release the record. And we're like, oh, okay. We thought, we'd written the best record in the world. And we're like, well, when do we have to do that? And he's like, by Monday morning. And it was Friday afternoon. He's like, so I'll see you on Monday. And then off we went. So over that weekend, we wrote Who Sold Her Out and Planet Earth. And he came back in on Monday, and he said, and we were like, okay, we've got our 2 singles. He was like, oh, okay. So we played them for him, and he was like, yeah, that'll do. That'll work. And then off we went. And, I'm really fond of those 2 songs.
Well, so you went from a very Britpop focus with Ed to a very Australian alternative centric producer with Paul McCartney for the second record.
Yeah, the second record was definitely a sum of its parts. I think we went into that record feeling a lot more confident in our abilities to sit down as a group of people with our songwriting formula. We were like, okay, now we know how to write a song. We've got a sense of musical self for the first time. And we'd been, I was really obsessed with bands like Wilco by that stage. So this kind of alt country thing was coming in for me a little bit in my songwriting. But we sat down with Paul McCartney, and he was really, really great sonically. And he sat down and he really just, we did that at the start of that record to tape. So it was quite a different experience. But then we took all those sessions home, and we did epic amounts of post-production, because we'd just got ourselves a Pro Tools rig, which is, the recording program that is in every studio that you go into in the world. And we just recorded every idea, everything in the kitchen sink. And then the second part of that record that was very, very important was Nick Launay mixed it for us. And Paul really started off the kind of the foundations of those songs with us and got that happening. But Nick was really good at like getting our ridiculous amount of ideas and just editing that down a little bit. So we had melodies going left, right, and center. We had like vocals. We had, we're basically trying to make Sgt. Pepper in that kind of sense. But Nick was really great at just going like fading in that melody and then fading it out and fading in that melody. And so his post-production producing was really, really important in that record, sounding like a concise piece of music. And I'm really, really proud of A Song Is a City, because it was the first time as a group that we had this vision from the start, and we saw it all the way through. And then the final product was pretty much like what it sounded like in our heads.
It's 2 incredible producers in Girl and A Song Is a City, which must have been a magnificent education for you. Did that give you the confidence then with Black Fingernails, Red Wine to go in and self-produce that album?
Yeah, I think that, maybe a little bit naively, we were like, we know how to do this now. We'd had this great education, with people like Ed Buller in song editing, and then people like McCartney, which was getting, great source sounds. And then people like Nick Launay, who was a great big picture guy. He was like really good at tightening up that big picture. So we took all of these amazing lessons we'd learned from these producers and took up camp at the Grove Studios, which was, I think it had just been sold, but had been built by Gary Beers from INXS. And we got Matt Lovell, who had worked with INXS a bunch and and he'd worked with Nick Launay quite a bit on a lot of the Silverchair records. We knew that he was going to pull some great sounds, and he knew the studio really, really well. So yeah, we went in there with all confidence and had an amazing time. And it was such a beautiful moment, Black Fingernails Red Wine, because it was one of those moments where everyone was on the same page about what we were trying to achieve. We wanted to do something a bit ambitious, a bit more widescreen, and we were starting to reference all of this kind of classic Australian music that we had grown up with, like, INXS and Icehouse and Midnight Oil and these kinds of characters. And we wanted to kind of wear that as a badge of honor a bit more, as opposed to this cultural cringe that had really, had been hanging around in Australia at that point in time.
I guess at that point you'd become one of Australia's most successful bands, and Chuggy's putting you on, headline tours, and there must have been an expectation, I guess. You just had a number 2 album with Songs of the City, number 6 for Black Fingernails. So the expectation when Inshallah came along, were you expecting that to be a number 1? Did it have to be a number 1 album, or had you...
Yeah, look, I think that it's one of those, kind of box ticking moments in your life where you're like, wouldn't it be nice to have a number 1 record? I mean, in the scheme of things, I don't think any of us look back and go, remember that time we had a number 1 record. We look at the whole picture. But I think, yeah, it felt like a really nice kind of momentum that we're moving up. And it was a really funny one going into making Inshallah, because we'd had this very successful record beforehand. We'd toured it for about 3 years. We'd toured it in Australia, and then it took off in the States, and we started touring it there. And so by the time we came home to start writing that record, it was, I think we really wanted to, push the boat out again. Like, we'd boiled it all down with Black Fingernails Red Wine, but really, I think the thing about being in a band is keeping it interesting for yourself. And so we were very lucky that we had a budget. So we brought on Gil Norton, who was, one of our favorite producers, who'd done all the Pixies records and Colour and the Shape and a whole bunch of other amazing albums. And interestingly enough, that Inshallah started with this song Foreign Land, that I had kind of come up with the original inspiration for that song by listening to a song called The Cutter by Echo and the Bunnymen, that Gil Norton had produced, funnily enough. And it starts with this kind of Middle Eastern, string section, and then the band kicks in. And of course, I didn't have a Middle Eastern string section at my, disposal. So I went to Mills Record Bar in Fremantle and bought a CD, which was The Sounds of Turkey. And I just found this kind of one little sample in the middle of this kind of, and I cut it up, and and I played my best John Bonham drum impression over the top. And then we went away to the States again and came back, and that was the point where everyone was like, okay, let's start making the record. What have you got? And I was like, well, I've got this. And everyone was like, well, what is that? Because we were such a Beatles band that it was always about, sitting down with the acoustic and writing a song from the ground up. And I had this other acoustic song, and I kind of was like, well, how about this? And I just sung it over the top. And we've been playing all these big shows, so we kind of, it was instinctual just to do something humongous and rock and roll. And yeah, we had a lot of fun making that song. But after that, we should have made a whole album of those songs, really, but we just wanted to experiment and do as much as we could.
Well, you definitely sold me on going back to listen to Echo and the Bunnymen this afternoon. I haven't heard The Cutter for years.
Yes, do it.
Then we get to Goes to the Past, which is kind of where the world repeats itself somehow concludes before we get to one new song on there as well, but in the back catalogue, but only one representation of that. Multiple songs off the other albums, but we're starting to fade out as we get to now. Yeah,
look, I'm really proud of every album that we've done. We went back to the Black Fingernails formula when we did that record, so we produced it ourselves, and we went back to the Grove Studios. And I don't think you can ever relive an experience twice. And I remember watching an interview with the guys from Crowded House, and they were talking about that. Like, if you try and go back and redo a formula again, it's never quite the same thing. And I do remember it, like, it was a really interesting experience for me personally as a songwriter, because I just come out of doing the Basement Birds album, and it was this really beautiful experience with all my friends. We just had acoustic guitars, and we made the whole record in my back shed in Freo, and it was great. And then we got back into the studio, and I think there was this kind of pressure from everyone in the band of like, you've done your acoustic album, now this has got to be rock and roll. And so we made this really like intense, like standing on a cliff top with like, fans in our face kind of record. And so, I think sonically, I mean, this sounds stupid, but it's my favorite drum sound we ever pulled. But I don't know if it's my favorite bunch of songs we ever did. So maybe it's probably like, there's a couple of songs I go back to now, like Echo, that I'm much more fond of now than I was for a while. But Love is a Drug was a great moment for us. I think that was a really good, I remember really feeling like that, the kind of energy of that in excess energy of that space kind of came back into the song again. Yeah.
The one that doesn't get represented here, but I'll ask you about it anyway, Wastelands. And again, you're dealing with Burke Reed, who'd worked with Cody Barnett, Dan Kelly, the Drones. And I guess, like from a production perspective, this one's kind of going back to A Song is a City.
Yeah, we had built a recording studio by this stage, and the idea was that we would be able to kind of just go in there and make records from now on. And it was funny because the studio was kind of half built. Burke was like living in the loft, which was like it was an old factory unit. I mean, the studio still exists, and it's an amazing place. I go in there and still record all the time. But it was half built when we were making that record, and it was, I think, a really interesting album because we knew we were going to take a bit of a hiatus afterwards. And so we had a talk and we said, let's do something completely left of center, and it's going to freak our fans out massively, but let's have some fun and just do something that we're like, well, if we never make it a record again, at least we did something really experimental and over there. And I actually think some of my favorite moments that we've ever done in the studio ever happened on that record. And probably one of my favorite Eskimo Joe songs ever is Running Out of Needs, which is the opening song on that album. And that was one of those moments where I just loved it. And I wish we had a little bit more time to make that record, because I would have loved to have just explored that a little bit more. But we recently did these symphony orchestra shows. I say recently, about 2 years ago now. But we recorded them, and we did Running Out of Needs with the orchestra. And I felt like that song finally got its moment in the sun, because with the orchestra behind it, and it's got something magical to it. And so I have really, really fond memories. But it was also quite a traumatic time for myself personally. There was a lot of inner turmoil going on in our band, and I knew that we were about to kind of say goodbye to each other for a while. So it was a really interesting time, but we made it through, and we made the record. And then if you fast forward to the song Say Something, which is also on the record, that was, I felt like we left the band at Wastelands, which was a really, again, vaguely traumatic album to make, just because of personalities and everything was kind of falling apart. But we didn't end the band. We just let's just go off and have a break for a while. But when we came back to do Say Something, it was a magical moment, because it's like this important journey we had to go on and go off into our own worlds and make other records with other people and do all these other things in our lives. And we came back together for Say Something, and we did another song called 99 Ways as well. And I just felt like, I couldn't be happier with the friendship that I have with those guys, and the musical connection of how much I can appreciate it now, how easy it is. Like all of the arguments we had over the years of trying to work out songs and all the rest of it, like you don't have to have that argument twice ever again. So when you come back together after 20 years and start making music again, it's actually really fun and really easy, because you're reminded of what a strong lineage and relationship you have with each other. So I feel like I'm really glad that, we managed to, even though it's a best of, that we got to put a brand new song on it, which I'm also really proud of.
Mm. So your next thing is a solo record. So when does Eskimo Joe come back together?
Well, we are going to be doing a big tour next year where we'll do A Song is a City and Black Fingernails, Red Wine back to back. and we're playing. It's called Black Fingernails, Red Wine in the City tour. Another mouthful, and that's really exciting because those two records are very important for us and very important for our fans as well. So that'll be great to give those songs the honor that they deserve and do them in one big show. And then I don't know when that'll conclude. Hopefully we'll get to do another new Eskimo Joe song around about that time. There's always songs floating around, so we'll probably try and get in the studio and do a new song again then. And then once that kind of wraps up, I would have completed all the bits and pieces for my solo record, so I'll probably launch that sometime mid-year next year, I imagine.
So if solo record's having guest vocalists on it, are you sort of like a musician on the record, or are you taking the front as well?
The thing about solo records is they take a long time because you end up playing everything, so it just takes ages. No, I've got a bunch of other friends who are great musos who've kind of stepped in and done some drums and bits and pieces, but it's pretty much me by myself in this space that you see doing everything. But it's a great chance to kind of muck around with extra vocalists and stuff. So there's going to be at least 2 kind of proper duets on the record, which will be really fun. And and it's the second solo album I've made, so I feel there's a large pressure on yourself when you go in to make your first solo record because you're like, who am I as a solo artist? And I feel like I've been able to now move through that, and it doesn't feel as overthought going into making another record. It feels like I'm just kind of making music and I'm enjoying it and it sounds good. But I'm such a pop kid at heart, so they're all going to sound like songs that you want to sing along to, because that's just what I do. I'm not going to make a weird left of center atmospheric record because I'm an artist. I'm driven to write songs with choruses. I can't help myself. So if you know Eskimo Joe and you've listened to my solo stuff, it's pretty easy to imagine what I'm going to write.
So, which Beatle are you in Eskimo Joe? Are you John, Paul, George? And I doubt you'll say Ringo.
I'm probably the John Lennon of the group, I would say, and Joel would be the Paul, and Stu would be the George, and I guess we all just have a little bit of Ringo in us.
Well said. Yeah. Okay, Kav, good to catch up.
You too, Paul. Thank you so much.